Well, big loser in this trade war could be Apple. At least that's what the street is saying. The stock has been on a wild ride. Just take a look at shares over the last 5 days. They're down nearly 7% today, though, rising just a bit, up just short of 2%, $188.96 a share. But here's what's going on, and here's why the street's worried. It's all about China, or Apple's exposure to China, and the fact that Apple relies on China for sales and assembles many of its products there, including its very important iPhone. Yahoo Finance's Dan Howley is here. And Dan, JPMorgan was out with a note earlier saying that Apple would need to raise iPhone prices by 14%, potentially, if we do see these tariffs go into effect. I mean, how big of an issue is this for Apple moving forward?
I think it's a huge issue. I mean, right now they're trying to transition their business from solely based on iPhone sales to the services side, but that doesn't mean that they still don't rely on iPhones. They still rely on them heavily. They still make up the bulk of their revenue each quarter. So if they're going to see an increase in price and they're trying to get people to upgrade, something that hasn't been happening as frequently as it used to be when we subsidized phones every 2 years, people would go and get a new one. Now they're holding off because phones are lasting longer. You're not going to get them to upgrade if the pricing on the phones is more expensive under these new tariffs. So this is something that could happen if the new if there's additional tariffs placed on the phones. Right now we have Dan Ives at Wedbush Securities saying that you'd see roughly 2 to 3% increases in prices with lithium-ion batteries. So that could be an issue for iPhones, but it's not certain yet if that would actually hit the company or if it would be passed through to consumers. You know, if Apple's able to kind of eat the cost, it would obviously eat into their earnings per share, but it would also mean that people are still buying the phones, which really helps their future, their long-term strategy of getting people to sign up for services. That's really what the phones are kind of now. They're conduits to get people into the services over time.
Yeah, Dan, I also found Dan Ives' notes pretty interesting because he also pointed out that China represents about 20% of all iPhone upgrades that are coming up over the next 12 to 18 months. When you take a look at the fact that why China is so important to Apple, it's not just the fact that because they make their phones over there, but it's also the Chinese consumer. They rely on the Chinese consumer, especially here for the future in terms of building out and growing their profits. If we do see the Chinese consumer confidence fall a little bit, I mean, I would think that this would also be a big concern for Apple. What do you think?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you know, they've already been struggling in China with the rise of Huawei. ZTE is a much smaller company, but there's homegrown Chinese companies that are really getting the bulk of the smartphone sales. And Apple is priced higher than those significantly in some cases. So they're trying to think of ways where they can attract more consumers. And if the prices for them go up, then that's just going to be game over for them at this point. You know, I think that if they can kind of work their way around these tariffs a little bit, they've been able to do that so far, then it would obviously benefit them. But if they run into problems on the Chinese side with the consumers over there, then it's really going to eat into their bottom line. We saw, obviously, they had issues when they had said they had revised their earnings previously last year, where they were saying that some of the Chinese consumers weren't buying as much, that consumer confidence wasn't there, so they were facing headwinds. And you saw what happened to Apple's stock. It took a big hit. So if that happens here with these tariffs, then it could also be another hit for them as well.
And it also just brings up the question about what this means for so many of Apple's suppliers. Big names like Dialog Semiconductor, Immersion Corp, Cirrus Logic getting a large percentage of their revenue from Apple. So we start to see a slowdown there because of iPhones. That, of course, could have a negative impact on a lot of these suppliers. Dan Howley, we'll check in with you in a little bit.